One bit of car technology that has barely moved on in the last 50 to 100 years has been cooling. An engine gets hot via the combustion, and that heat is then transferred to coolant that's circulating around the cylinders in water jackets. That hot coolant is then pumped to a radiator or heat exchanger if you want to go full engineer. As the hot coolant works its way down the radiator, cooling air interacts with it, cooling the coolant. By the time the coolant gets to the bottom of the radiator, that heat has been extracted, so the fluid is then pumped back around the engine to do the job all over again. But there is a fluid that's currently being fine-tuned across the world that could totally change the car cooling game, and in doing so, change the looks of road and race cars forever. There's a company based in Australia that also has a UK office called Flexegraph that's ran by this guy, Shannon Notley, and they've been experimenting with this material known as graphene. Now, graphene is amazing stuff. It has the highest thermal conductivity of any material known to man. Sheets of graphene are only a single atom in thickness, meaning heat conducts incredibly quickly through it. If you hold a strip of graphene, the heat from your hands will allow it to cut through an ice cube without much bother at all. It's also exceptionally strong, 200 times stronger than steel, as well as being light. A comparable sheet of paper is 1,000 times heavier than the same sheet of graphene. It's such an awesome material that numerous F1 teams have been experimenting with it, although somewhat predictably, it's currently banned by the FIA. Lots of companies are finding more and more uses for graphene, but Flexegraph has specifically concentrated on using graphene in fluids. Because of that thermal conductivity like no other, graphene can dramatically improve the cooling of an internal combustion engine. For decades, the cooling liquid has been the main limiting factor to radiator design, cementing a ceiling in for engineers that want to iterate to increase efficiency and performance. To show just how little the game has moved on in the car cooling stakes, this is a radiator from a 1924 Ford Model T, and this is a radiator from a 2024 Volkswagen Golf GTI. Yes, the inlet and outlet have slightly changed positions, but really, these things are doing effectively the exact same job with very, very similar designs. But we have a revolution on our hands, and it is through the use of graphene in the coolant. Flexegraph are coming up with a brand new thing called a nanofluid, which has graphene particles suspended within the coolant. What will that graphene do? Well, it will massively up the coolant's thermal conductivity, and that means it will much more effectively take heat, transfer it from an internal combustion engine, and get that waste heat out to the surroundings. This has two major impacts on a car, the first of which being you can make your radiator much smaller. Flexegraph says this graphene nanofluid works 60% more efficiently than normal coolant. That means you need less surface area from your radiator, so you can muck about with the frontal area, the fin sizing, the fin spacing, and that can then transform what a road or race car looks like. Cars that use the traditional front-mounted orientation like this one would need much less of a gaping hole to feed air into the heat exchanger. By decreasing the size of one of these by 60%, the bonnet could come down lower, so the whole intake's much lower. It could be narrower, it could be much, much shorter. If nanofluid becomes mainstream, cars will look completely different to what they do now.
Big things have small beginnings.
Imagine an F1 car that side pods could be 60% smaller. Mercedes tried something similar recently that didn't go too well, but the need for gaping wide side pods to cool those big radiators would just go, meaning that race cars across the globe would become much more aero-like, proper jet fighters with wheels. Saying that, they might want to keep the width to keep the surface area for downforce, but the cars would have a much lower profile. By decreasing the size of the heat exchanger in either side of an F1 car by 60% would mean that the radiators could sit lower in the car, which brings down the center of gravity and reduces drag. This nanofluid stuff, it's epic. Another huge benefit is increasing power. By more effectively cooling your engine, you can turn up the wick, run it hotter, and create more oomph. It is said in the motorsport world that a 0.2 degree difference in cylinder temperature can equate to 10 horsepower. Flexegraph have ran tests and they have found a 2 degree difference in cylinder temperature. If you were a race engineer and you've switched your car's coolant to this nanofluid and achieved a 100 horsepower increase in engine tune, your team principal would be giving you a very big pat on the back. That gain comes from the more effective cooling from the nanofluid, allowing you to raise the knock limit of your engine, that being the limit where pre-detonation starts to occur within your cylinder. You don't want that, it can muck up your engine. By raising the knock limit, you can start mucking about with air-fuel ratios and ignition timing to create more power, as well as running the engine leaner to save fuel. If anyone wants to take on Red Bull next season, get some graphene nanofluid into your car, turn up the wick, and I reckon you'll have 3 laps of racing before you've got Christian Horner on the phone to the stewards. Founder man Notley himself has said most modern engines are already very close to the knock limit, but if you can run your engine hotter, even by a small amount, then the fuel efficiency gains can be quite substantial. Then there is the benefit of evening out the temperature across the system. For example, hot spots on cylinder liners can lead to a process called nuclear boiling, where gas bubbles form on the surface and the heat cannot be transferred through the gas efficiently. These hot spots lead to fatigue and eventually failure. The ability to reduce or reuse heat more efficiently across the whole system rather than just a specific area due to improved thermal conductivity is really important. So why isn't this fluid absolutely everywhere in the automotive landscape? Well, it seems to have been very difficult to develop. Graphene sits right between being hydrophilic, it loves water, and hydrophobic, it hates this stuff. Unless the graphene is perfectly suspended within your coolant, it is not working that effectively. The tricky bit is coolant has loads of other additives within it. It's got anti-corrosion stuff, it's got anti-freeze, dye, the list goes on. Graphene seems to be very sensitive to the combination of those ingredients. You can massively improve one aspect of the coolant, but if your nanoparticles aren't suspended right, well, there's no point in classing it as a nanofluid, it's just going to be crap. Flexegraph already has a graphene coolant product on the market, but to a much smaller scale. They have come out with computer coolant that has graphene within it. There are tests online that show the graphene nanofluid versus a normal computer coolant, which is relevant to us because apparently computer coolant is very close to a normal average car coolant. I've put a link in the description below to the Linus Tech Tips channel. They've done a great video comparing graphene nanofluid to normal computer coolant. I think you'll be surprised by the result. I think there's work to do on this graphene stuff. Like most pioneering technologies, it looks like it's going to take time for this new car cooling recipe to really get nailed. But the potential doors it can open could be game-changing, providing that evolutionary leap in cars that we haven't had for over a decade, and in the case of radiators, in over a century. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. I've been Mike, and don't forget to subscribe to DRIVETRIBE.